Well, welcome to this 8th annual Rethinking Hell Conference. When we started this conference back in 2014 at the Linear Theological Library in Houston to celebrate the life and work of Edward Fudge, we sort of dreamed that it would be an annual conference that we would come back to every year. But I don't think any of us, the small group of us that were involved at that point, I don't think that we really believed that this would go on to be something that would happen every single year, that we would go from Houston in 2014 to Pasadena in 2015 to London, England in 2016, and then Auckland, New Zealand in 2017, Dallas, Fort Worth in 2018, Enid, Oklahoma in 2019, and then my neck of the woods, Seattle, Washington in 2020 last year. Even though we're doing it virtually this year because of COVID and other things, nevertheless, we are still keeping up the conference, and I'm really excited about that. And I'm really pleased and honored to be a part of a ministry that has continued to bring the message of life in Christ to the world year after year after year for almost a decade now. And I'm really excited to see where the next 2 years of conferences take us. I have a little bit of inkling as to when those will be, where those will be, and but I'm not entirely sure, so it'll be exciting to see what the Lord has in store. I want to begin by issuing some thanks, first of all, and most importantly, to my friend and fellow Rethinking Hell contributor, Peter Grice, because this year he has done virtually 100% of all of this conference planning and organization. In past years, there were several of us involved, and so we were able to share the burden, spread it across multiple people, and all of us are volunteers. None of us are paid staff or anything like that. And so having a team of people to organize and plan a conference has been helpful, but Peter has had to shoulder that burden virtually entirely himself this year. And so I just want to thank you, Peter, very much. It means the world to me, and I'm honored and privileged to be able to call you a friend and a colleague. So thank you for that. Thanks also to my fellow speakers for their fantastic contributions to the conference. I've gotten to watch a few of them before recording this video, and they're absolutely stellar. They blow mine out of the water. You guys are all really classing this conference up. If it were just me, it would be a pretty poor conference, I think. So thank you guys for your involvement, for the hard work and the time that you've given to preparing for your videos, recording your videos, and then fielding questions as they come in over the, in the days to come. So thank you so much for that. And I'm honored and privileged to be able to share the proverbial stage with you. I also want to thank the Rethinking Hell Ministry for inviting me to speak at another conference. I'm the sort of public face. I do Rethinking Hell Live, and I do a lot of the interviews and podcasts and things like that. So a lot of people think that I'm like the guy. And they would say, well, of course you're going to speak at every conference. Well, no, that's not the case at all. Ever since I was invited to be a plenary speaker at our second conference in Pasadena, I have not taken for granted that I would get to speak at each year's conference, and I've gone to great lengths to insist that it be something that the Rethinking Hell Ministry makes a conscious decision about as to whether or not to have me speak, because quite frankly, I don't think all that highly of myself, and I think that there are other speakers who could do better. So the fact that I was given an invitation for another year means a lot. I'm honored and privileged, and I hope that my presentation will at least approximate half of the quality that the other speakers at this conference have put into their videos. And I also want to thank you viewers, those of you watching, the virtual attendees, for your time, the time that you're taking to watch each of the speakers' presentations, but also the money that you've spent with registering for the conference to get access to these videos. You, the people that are watching this right now, you are why we do what we do, and you're what make it possible. We don't make any money doing what we do in this ministry, doing these conferences. In fact, the conferences in particular, we tend to lose money. I think we've lost money pretty much every single year, and probably will this year as well. But that's okay, because we are we're interested in edifying you and being edified by you, to sharpening each other's iron. And so you viewers are the ones that make this worth doing. So thank you for your continued support, both financially and in terms of time. And I trust and pray that the presentations this year have made you feel as though your time and money has been worth it. A few things I want to announce just right here at the front of the presentation to get them out of the way, and then I'll jump in. First of all, I want to announce that there's an upcoming, forthcoming study Bible being published by a publisher that will announce it early next year. That's my understanding. And it includes almost 9,000 words of notes that I have contributed on the topic of the afterlife. I'm supposed to not let the cat quite out of the bag yet. There are some inklings around on the internet. You can find them, but they are few and far between. But I think in February is when the publisher plans to announce it, and I'm really excited about not just my personal contribution to that study Bible coming out, but also the fact that Rethinking Hell as a ministry will no doubt be mentioned in my, in the contributors page or whatever next to my name. So big times for our ministry, and I'm really excited about that. Also big times for our ministry is a multidisciplinary Two Views book that I'm currently co-editing with Paul Copan for IVP Academic. Multidisciplinary is the key here. Most Two Views books or 3 or 4 or 5 view books, each view is represented by a single person with a single discipline, a single specialty. And Paul and I think that is something of a weakness, something of a deficiency in the literature that we want to improve upon. And so we're introducing a multidisciplinary Two Views book. We will have both the doctrine of eternal torment and the doctrine of conditional immortality represented, but not by one representative each, but by 6 in the fields of biblical theology, exegesis, historical theology, systematic theology, philosophy, and pastoral theology. All 6 of those disciplines, we have a scholar from each of those 6 fields on each of the 2 sides of the debate, and then they will interact with each other in their responses to their essays. So I think it's going to be a tremendous, fantastic book, a really important book that I think will be one to which participants in this debate for years to come will look back. And once again, Rethinking Hell is an integral part of this, and so I'm thrilled for Rethinking Hell's getting to be a part of a book being published by IVP Academic here, hopefully, probably late 2022 or early 2023 is my guess. Also, Preston Sprinkle, if you don't recognize the name, he's actually the co-author of Erasing Hell with Francis Chan, and this was published back, I think, in the early 2010s, and at the time, Preston Sprinkle was a believer in eternal torment. Well, since then, he has gone on to embrace conditional immortality and annihilationism, and he's the host of the Popular Theology and the Raw podcast, and he's hosting his very first conference in 2022 from March 31st to April 2nd, and it's going to be called the Exiles in Babylon Conference, I think, something along those lines. And at that debate, I will be somewhat debating. It'll be a friendly conversation, but there'll be some formalities to it. Gary Brashears, he's the co-author of a book called Doctrine with Mark Driscoll, and he's a teacher, he's a professor, and he's a really big name, and I'm really excited and honored to get to have the conversation with him over the nature and duration of hell. So if you want to register for that conference, it's in Boise, Idaho. There's both in-person registration options and virtual registration options. You can go to PrestonSprinkle.com, I think is the website, or just look up Preston Sprinkle and you'll find his website, and his conference information is right there. So I'd love to see you there, or I'd love for you to watch that conversation online if you want to register virtually. And then I think the last announcement I wanted to make is just that I've recently launched my own personal website at chrisdate.info, where you can access all of my work. For several years now, when I've been doing interviews and videos and things like that, whenever I've been asked to tell people where to go to find my work, I've got to rattle off a long list of things. You go to rethinkinghell.com, go to the Rethinking Hell podcast in iTunes, go to the Rethinking Hell YouTube channel, go to the Theapologetics YouTube channel, go to Academia to find my journal articles, or go to the Amazon author page to find my books. And it's just been a real pain in the rear end. And so I've launched my own personal website, chrisdate.info, with the help of a really savvy web developer, where we have baked into the website the ability to easily navigate navigate and search for content that you're interested in. And pretty much everything that I've done, or at least the vast majority of the things that I've done, are available there, including journal articles that I've gotten published. And I very much appreciate your patronage, if you will, although there's nothing there that you have to pay for. So hopefully you find that resource useful if for some strange reason you're interested in what I have to say. Now, for those of you watching who aren't familiar with who I am, thank you for tuning in, first of all, because I think most often I speak to people who are familiar with who I am in our ministry. If you're not, thank you especially for tuning in. It means a lot that you are giving this conversation the fair hearing that it deserves. But if you aren't familiar with me, let me tell you a little bit about myself. First of all, I am a conservative evangelical. I was converted from atheism in the summer of 2002. It was almost a year or slightly more than a year, something like that, after my first son was born. Prior to that, I had no faith of any sort, hardly any exposure whatsoever to Christian theology, to Christian living. And by the grace of God, I was converted to Christianity in 2002, and ever since I have been a very conservative, very evangelical, and for most of that time, very reformed Christian. And I have been involved in theology and apologetics ministry since 2009, when I started a blog that no longer is being kept up, because in 2011, I think it might have been 2010, but right there in 2010, 2011, I started podcasting, and I think that's where I started to gain some notoriety. And then in 2019, I started regularly YouTubing for Rethinking Hell. Rethinking Hell has now a bi-weekly, every other week, live stream that I host Mondays at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. And on alternating Mondays, I do my own personal YouTube live show called The Apologetics. So every Monday at 6 p.m. Pacific, virtually every Monday, I am doing some streaming on YouTube. And for better or for worse, those various ways I've been engaged in ministry have attracted some attention to me. Evidently, some people think that I have some things that are worth hearing. I am known for defending both essential Christian doctrines and certain non-essential Christian doctrines. So, for example, I am known for defending the Trinity and the Incarnation. I have debated Unitarian Dale Tuggy, both in person and in print. And very recently, I debated Jake Broncatella, I think is his name, the so-called Muslim metaphysician. We discussed whether Jesus, or whether the Trinity is logically coherent. And here in just a few days, I will be debating Shabir Ali on whether the New Testament teaches that Jesus is God. So the Trinity, the Incarnation, these essentials of the faith are important to me, and I'm known for defending them, as I'm known for defending secondary non-essentials of the faith, like Calvinism, amillennialism, and preterism. I put partial in very small text next to preterism because most people know of my view as partial preterism, but I really hate that language for reasons that I won't go into in this presentation. But what I'm perhaps best known for is my involvement with the ministry Rethinking Hell, for promoting and defending conditional immortality and annihilationism. And that's what we're talking about here, although the purpose of this conference obviously isn't just to promote and defend conditionalism. And just to be clear, for those of you who don't know me, what convinced me, in fact, what got me even considering conditional immortality and annihilationism was Scripture. I had never had any reservations about the doctrine of eternal torment since I became a Christian. It was not something that kept me up at night. It wasn't something I was looking for some sort of alternative solution to. I began to be interested in conditionalism and became convinced of it because I was convinced by Scripture. And I think Scripture is inerrant. I don't just think it's infallible. I think it's inerrant, and I think it's supremely authoritative. And so I had to bend my knee in subjection to what Scripture teaches, at least as far as I can tell. I am a graduate of Liberty University with a Bachelor of Science in Religion, and from Fuller Seminary, where I earned a Master of Arts in Theology, where concentrating in the Old Testament. And I hope to pursue an Old Testament doctorate at a prestigious UK school like Cambridge or Oxford or something like that. Really importantly, I don't necessarily share the ethos of some of these schools, or at least the ethos that a lot of people think these schools have. So on the one hand, I am very, very conservative, and so Liberty felt very at home. But on the other hand, I am not as rabidly pro-Republican as I think a lot of the people involved in Liberty's leadership are. So on the one hand, I was not, I wasn't entirely on board with the ethos of Liberty, but I also wasn't entirely on board with the ethos at Fuller, where arguably they are to some degree to my left. I didn't choose the schools that I chose because I wanted to go to school in an echo chamber. I went to schools where I thought that I would be stretched and challenged. Liberty did that in some ways, Fuller did it in others, and I'm sure that wherever the Lord has me end up for my doctorate studies, I'll be stretched there as well. I'm an adjunct professor of Bible and Theology at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary, where Braxton Hunter, my fellow speaker, is the president. And I'm an elder in development and occasional preacher at Table of Hope Community Church in Puyallup, Washington. And I've been married to my wife, Star, for over 20 years now, and we have 4 sons, ranging in age from 8 at our youngest all the way up to 20 in terms of our oldest. So that's a little bit about me, but I want to go back even further back in time. Those of you who know that I'm super obsessive about grammar will know why I smiled when I corrected myself there. But I want to introduce you to my very first car that I got when I was 16 years old back in 1995, I think it was. My first car was an early 80s Volkswagen Rabbit that looked very similar to the one that's on the screen right here. In 1995, my mom bought it for me for just $500. Super cheap. Today, I'm sure obviously prices have increased, but today if we go to a used car lot or something like that, we'll spend several $1,000s on just a used car. Well, this one cost my mom $500. I'm sure that was a little more expensive than it is now, but still, it wasn't that much. $500 was fairly, relatively a drop in the bucket compared to what would be spent on other cars. And it was an ugly brown color, and it was an outdated style. I was not at all, it wasn't the kind of car that, you're excited to be seen in. It didn't have any modern amenities. It didn't have, at this point in time, CDs were popular. It didn't have a CD player. I don't even know if it had a tape deck. It was just like a radio. It didn't have any modern amenities. And this is the funny thing. It couldn't manage consistently even 10 miles per hour going up a steep hill. In Kent, Washington, where I grew up, there's a road called James that goes from the valley up to the top of a hill, and it's fairly steep relative to other hills that you might drive up. And I remember I would have to, when I would get onto the road leading up to that hill, I would have to get up to as high a speed as I could, significantly exceeding the speed limit, just to build up enough momentum to get me part of the way up the hill before it slowed down to a crawl at 10 miles per hour. Because as soon as that happened, and it did happen every single time I got on that hill, cars would be driving by me, honking and angrily, angry that I was not keeping up with the speed limit. So it was a real beater. It was a real junker. And yet, despite all of these problems, I absolutely loved that car. Absolutely loved it. There was one other car I think that I had a couple of years later that I liked more, but this one I really loved, even though it was cheap, it was outdated, it was ugly, and it had a real terrible time climbing hills. By contrast, my oldest sons, they were guaranteed their first cars, and they were taken to lots to choose their first cars from among a variety of options. And what's more, they knew that they would be taken to other lots if they weren't happy with all of the options at the first lot. And in fact, when we went to those first lots, they were indeed happy with, or unhappy with several of the options there that were far, far better than that Volkswagen Rabbit was for me when I was given it in 1995. And had we forced them to accept one of those poorer options in their mind, which again were far better than my Volkswagen Rabbit, they would have complained. They would have been upset. They would have moaned and whined about the fact that they'd been given a less, not as high quality car as they wanted. And when I reflect upon this, I ask myself, well, what is the difference? Why, on the one hand, was I thrilled to be given a cheap, ugly junker? But, 20 years later or whatever, my sons would complain and moan if they had to be given a car that was much better than the one that I had, simply because they could have had something even better. Well, I want to propose something that I want to build up to. It begins with the recognition that my sons took the gift of a first car for granted. Unlike me. You see, I didn't know, I had no guarantee that I was going to get a car. I'm not even sure, my memory is fuzzy from this long ago, but I'm not even sure I had any expectation that I would get a car. It's just all of a sudden my mom bought me one because I was about to turn 16 and I was learning how to drive and stuff. And so, unlike me, my sons were guaranteed their first car, which meant that they took it for granted. And so if they had been forced to take a poorer option, they would have received it not as a gift, but as the withholding of a better car. And the question I want to ask is, what if their choice wasn't between cars? What if their choice was a beater or no car at all? And in fact, what if all of their friends faced that exact same choice? In other words, what if instead of a choice between a car they don't like and a car they do, what if everybody just had the choice between a car or no car at all, regardless of how good the car is that they could choose to take instead of no car at all? I suspect that if this were the case, they would enthusiastically accept the beater, because the alternative would be nothing at all. And what this leads me to want to propose to you, our viewers, is what if this is partly to blame, this phenomenon, for the culture of death in the West? What if centuries of telling the world that they can take life for granted has made them indifferent to it? Now, for those of you who have been following this ministry or following this debate, you'll know what I'm getting at, but some of you might not. And what I'm getting at is that the doctrine of eternal torment has told the world just that for centuries. Here's a Redditor who just recently on the Christianity Reddit room, I don't know what you're supposed to call those things, but they say this: everybody gets eternal life. The question is not if there is eternal life for everyone. The question is, what part of eternity? In the light or in the darkness? In heaven or in hell? Now you might think, well, Chris, why are you starting with some rando on Reddit? How is that representative of the doctrine of eternal torment? Well, first of all, I start with this just to show that this is what many, many lay Christians, the average Joes in the pews, think is the case, believing in eternal torment, that everybody gets eternal life, and it's just a matter of whether they're going to live it in the good place or the bad place. But it's not just lay people. Billy Graham says in his book, the Heaven Answer book, that this life on earth is nothing compared to the everlasting life to come, but where will you spend that life? Here's Rod Parsley. Listen to the way that he puts it in this baby dedication service that he's narrating.
Please care that much about their eternity, because they're going to live forever somewhere.
Mentioning this pastor is particularly relevant since he fancies himself something of a cultural commentator. So we've got, self-perceived cultural commentators speaking to the culture, telling them they're going to live forever somewhere in the good place or the bad place. You see, contrary to what you may not realize if you're not very familiar with the hell debate, the doctrine of everlasting conscious punishment isn't merely everlasting conscious punishment. It's also the view that God will render the resurrected bodies of the lost immortal so that they can live physically forever in hell. And this has been the case ever since the first Christians that started talking the doctrine of eternal torment started doing so. Tatian says that the wicked will receive the painful with immortality, unlike the saved who receive the immortal with enjoyment. This was in the latter half of the 2nd century. Same time period, Athenagoras of Athens says, we will live another life, either a better one or a worse one, and in fire, for God has not made us that we should perish and be annihilated. How ironic it is, by the way, that the Bible says exactly that people who go to hell will perish, whereas Athenagoras is here saying, no, God didn't make us to perish. I'm not so sure about that. Augustine, a little bit later, says the spirit, the human spirit or soul, can't die and is immortal, and he says that property of being immortal will be in the resurrected bodies of the damned in hell. John MacArthur in 2009 said that the message of the Bible is that every human being who has ever lived will live forever. John Piper, you are an embodied soul who will live forever in heaven or in hell. And Wayne Grudem, the systematic theologian on whose systematic theology I cut my teeth as a young theologian nearly 20 years ago. He says in his systematic theology that once people sin, God's justice requires that they live forever in hell. You see, for centuries, ever since at least the time of Augustine, the church has told the world that everyone will live forever no matter what. Maybe that's at least part of the reason why the post-Christian West doesn't care about life and embraces a culture of death. That's something I'm going to come back to a little bit later in this presentation, but that's the start of, that's why I'm talking about the culture of death and its relevance to the topic of conditional immortality and the afterlife more broadly. So let me tell you, excuse me, what I want to do in the time that I have remaining. Firstly, I want to identify what I mean by a culture of death and why I think it's something that people of a variety of different perspectives and backgrounds should be able to agree upon. Secondly, I want to talk about the actions that might be needed to engage in cultural CPR, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. But then I'm going to take a break for a moment and look at what the church's role might need to be in cultural CPR besides merely just actions. And then having talked about that, I want to talk about some of the beliefs that I think will need to change. And then very, very briefly, I'll talk about experiences. And you'll see why all of these things are related and relevant here shortly. So first of all, what do I mean by the culture of death? What are the identifying traits of the culture of death? Well, the culture of death is a phrase that is most often, I think, used to describe certain aspects of our medical and bioethics complexities in the West. John R. Ling, in his book Bioethical Issues, puts it this way: human life was for centuries described by adjectives such as special, unique, sacred, inviolable, and non-expendable, but within the last 60 years or so, medicine has adopted a low view of human life. Nowadays, human life can uncontroversially be considered as cheap, insignificant, exploitable, trivial, expendable. And this view of life as cheap, insignificant, expendable, that is what is meant by the culture of death. And again, this is usually this phrase is usually used to describe medical and bioethics issues, or the culture that is embracing certain medical and bioethics views, beginning with the topic of abortion. And this is not going to be any surprise. Obviously, conservative evangelical Christians like me who count themselves pro-life are going to see abortion as sort of the one of the biggest aspects of the culture of life. And there's, I think for good reason, that we're going to treat this topic as so important. Since the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973, there have been over 62 million abortions. 62 million people have been murdered since 1973, but justly, legally. Well over 1 million per year and increasing every year. That's, there were 5, 6, 7 million Jews, I think, killed in the Holocaust. Well, we have a fraction, a large fraction, 20% or slightly less than that, of a Holocaust every single year. Sadly, over 30% of the population in the West, or at least in America, wants abortion legal under any circumstances whatsoever. Over 50% of the population wants doctors and other medical professionals to be unable, not permitted, to opt out of performing those things. So in other words, the greater part of the culture wants doctors forced to murder. And 40 or more percent of the population wants abortion legal simply if the mother and family don't feel like they can afford a child. Imagine if your mother decided she and her family couldn't afford to raise you, and so they decided to just kill you instead. That's tragic. In fact, abortion isn't just a lamented necessity in the eyes of pro-choice people. It is something to be shouted. There's a whole movement, shout your abortion, where women are proud and shouting joyfully from the rooftops that they have asked medical professionals to murder their child. And I really don't think that this is something that just conservative evangelical Christians like me can get behind, this problem of abortion being indicative of a culture of death. The Democrats for Life America website says that our mission is to defend universal human rights within the Democratic Party, to end the influence of systems of pervasive injustice, particularly the mass lethal injustice of abortion. The people behind this Democrats for Life America group are not going to be nearly as conservative as I am, at least in a lot of ways, including politically, and yet they too see the problem with mass abortion. In fact, many pro-choice Christians want to see fewer abortions. They just think that criminalization isn't the best way to do it, but rather there are other ways to reduce the numbers of abortions. And they think, and it could be, that fighting abortion might be part of a larger progressive and or Democrat vision of protecting life from womb to tomb. Now, I'm not a Democrat. In fact, I refuse to vote Democrat any longer. But the point is, this is something that conservatives like me and progressives, like many of whom will vote Democrat, should be able to agree on. But it's not just abortion. It's a number of other medical and bioethics issues that John Ling points out. Can all of them result directly or indirectly in death? And so I want to go through this list that he offers of things on top of abortion, beyond abortion, beginning with infanticide. I mean, abortion already is infanticide, but here he's talking about the homicide of born children. The Netherlands permits, right now, the termination of newborns facing a life of suffering. In other words, a mother gives birth in the Netherlands, and if the doctors discover that child, that newborn, will face a life of suffering by their estimation, they won't be prosecuted if they allow that, if they kill that baby. In the U.S., homicides on the victim's day of birth are more than 5 times more likely than any other day of their lives. Not talking here about abortion, talking here about mothers abandoning their childs in dumpsters to be exposed to the elements and die, or, killed in some other way. The most dangerous, the most vulnerable day of your life in America, in terms of risk of being murdered, is your day of birth. How about surrogacy? Surrogacy sounds like a life-giving thing, right? Well, hold on. Egg donation is temptingly lucrative. Women can make a lot of money by donating their eggs, and so they are turning their life-giving biology into commodity. That's not life-giving. And worse, many egg donors, as a result of the hormone procedures and things that they go into in order to produce more eggs for donation, many people who go through those treatments end up developing infertility, or worse, breast or colon cancer, sometimes going on to die. You see, surrogacy, while it's meant to give life to a family that otherwise wouldn't be able to receive it, is actually life inhibiting. It's death producing in many cases. Again, what about in vitro fertilization? This is the kind of thing that a lot of families are going to think is meant to be life-giving. It's meant to take couples who have a difficulty conceiving and giving birth, a medical ability to be able to experience that joy despite their natural inefficiencies, their deficiencies. Well, consider that the process of in vitro fertilization involves the artificial fertilization of several eggs at one time, or even successive occurrences, and then they freeze some of those fertilized eggs, some of those embryos, indefinitely for future use. So what you're doing is, yes, you are creating life, but then you're immediately freezing most of it, hoping one day you'll be able to do something with those embryos. But even in the event that those frozen embryos end up getting used to try to get a woman pregnant, the reality is that most of, or at least many of those frozen embryos are abandoned after early successes. So, after a bunch of eggs are fertilized, a bunch of embryos are created, and then most of them are frozen. The first ones that are implanted into the woman's womb, if those are successful, very often the ones that got frozen will just get abandoned. So yeah, you're creating some life, but then just to die. In fact, even among the ones that then get unfrozen and implanted, most embryos fertilized through the process of in vitro fertilization don't ultimately survive. So, as far as I can tell anyway, it seems as if in vitro fertilization is far more about death than it is life, because most of the life produced in the process of in vitro fertilization is subsequently killed. What about euthanasia? Well, this one is pretty obvious, but just for those of you who aren't super familiar with the terrain of this debate, under the guise of dignity in dying, doctor-assisted suicide is increasingly legal. Now, of course, they're not going to like, advocates of this don't like calling it doctor-assisted suicide, but that's what it is. They're being assisted in ending their lives before their lives end naturally. The Netherlands and Switzerland have seen 3- and 4-fold increases in euthanasia and or doctor-assisted suicide since 2002. So in the past nearly 20 years, the numbers of euthanized patients and suicide victims, doctor-assisted suicide victims, have multiplied 3 and 4 times in the past 20 years. In fact, over 200 people, non-Swiss citizens, traveled to Switzerland in 2018 alone in order to be assisted in committing suicide. This is definitely a culture of death. What about prenatal screening and eugenics? Scientists in America, I learned in the process of preparing for this presentation, scientists in America are permitted to grow embryos for up to 14 days for research and then to destroy them. So embryos are being grown for up to 1 or 2 weeks in order to do research on them, and then they are killed. That's the eugenics part of this. But then you combine that with prenatal screening, and what I'm talking about here is that over 50% of the population wants first trimester abortion legal if there's nothing else wrong except that the child would be born with some sort of disability or with Down syndrome. There's where the prenatal screening and the eugenics combine. Most people in the West want mothers to be able to murder their unborn children just because they might end up disabled. In fact, talking about Down syndrome, did you know that Iceland has gotten rid of Down syndrome? Check this out.
Next tonight at 10, Iceland has all but eliminated Down syndrome. That was a headline that captured the attention of many. But the eradication isn't the result of a breakthrough medical treatment, rather through abortions.
A recent CBSN report shows that since the early 2000s, when prenatal screening tests were introduced in the country, nearly 100% of women who received a positive test for Down syndrome terminated their pregnancy.
You see, Iceland didn't just get rid of Down syndrome. They got rid of people with Down syndrome. That's the culture of death. And this isn't limited to medical and bioethics issues. I mean, I just gave some thought to other areas, and in a short amount of time was able to come up with the list I'm about to show you. I'm sure you could come up with countless others. What about skyrocketing obesity rates and the fat acceptance movement? And I say that as a morbidly obese person myself. Look, I'm all for people not bullying and making fun of and shaming people for their obesity. But the fact is that it is a pandemic in this country, in the West more largely, but especially in our country. And there's actually a movement that's saying fat is great, fat is sexy, fat is healthy. No. This kind of lifestyle, being as obese and as unfit as I am and as many others of us are, is not healthy, and it leads to death, not life. How about skyrocketing promiscuity rates and rates of STDs? These casual sex outside of marriage continues to rise, and so too do life-inhibiting, sometimes life-ending, sexually transmitted diseases. How about self-mutilation and the causing of infertility as part of the process of so-called gender reassignment? In fact, there are segments of the population that think that young children, not just teenagers, which would, where their gender reassignment would involve infertility and mutilation, but young children under 10 years old should be able to have puberty blockers and things that will cause infertility and possibly, depending upon what is being argued for, that might involve self-mutilation. This is not life-giving. This is life-inhibiting, if not life-ending. How about life-inhibiting alternative sexual lifestyles? Whatever you think about whether the morality of homosexuality and promiscuity and other things, the reality is that each of these are less healthy, less life-giving lifestyles. And of course, marriages between people of the same sex don't produce life at all. How about plummeting dangerously low birth rates? We are dangerous. In America, our birth rates are dangerously low, to the point where our population will start to decline, as it has been in China, because of their forced by the state low birth rates. Our culture is not one that is producing enough life to keep itself going. It is a culture of death. How about increases in the numbers of school shootings? We see multiple times a year now, and seemingly increasing numbers of them every year, shootings where people are going and killing kids. How about digital escapism, addictions to technology, video games, social media? I get nervous if I don't have my phone, close at hand for very long. We are not embracing life. We are trying to escape it, because I think we're a culture of death. And it's not just limited to conservative issues or Christian issues. That is, issues that Christians and conservatives like me identify as indicative of a culture of death. I spoke with my leftist, progressive, non-Christian teenage relative who sees additional symptoms of a culture of death. I asked him, from your perspective, unlike mine, what do you see as symptoms of a culture of death? And he came up with some brilliant examples. Consumerism or commercialism. We are inhibiting life and promoting death because we're telling people that the solution to a happy life, the way to have a happy life, is to just buy, consume. And that is not life-giving. He also pointed out the problem of social atomization or isolation. We are devaluing family and community, and we are increasingly siloing ourselves as individuals in isolation from community and from, social media and the internet, while they do bring people that are way far apart on the globe into contact with one another, these technologies have paradoxically isolated us further and further from one another. This isn't a Christian or conservative that sees this. This is a non-Christian leftist. and a teenager. And he even identified the problem of gratuitous violence in entertainment, whether it's TV, movies, or video games. Look, I love violent video games, violent movies, violent TV shows, where the violence is an important part of the story. But my relative, a non-Christian teenage leftist, recognizes that in all those different and other forms of entertainment, violence has become gratuitous and obligatory. This isn't a culture of life. This is a culture of death. You see, what I'm trying to argue here is that people of all backgrounds should be able to agree that our Western culture has become a culture of death. And the question I want to ask in the presentation today is, what can Christians do to breathe life back into this culture of death? That's what I mean by cultural CPR. So let's talk about cultural CPR, beginning with actions. You see, if we're going to breathe life back into a culture of death, naturally we're going to want to start with, what can we do externally? What actions can we take to breathe life into a culture of death? This is the whole point of this conference, is engaging the culture, right? So this action of CPR is the way, what I want to start with, looking at how we can engage the culture in terms of mortality and afterlife issues. And I want to leverage this results pyramid that the authors of Change the Culture, Change the Game have introduced. And we'll look at this throughout the rest of my presentation, but I want to begin with here at the top of the pyramid. Of course, results begin with actions, in the sense that actions are what most immediately produce results. And we Christians, I think, to some degree, have this part of things down, this issue of actions. You see, when it comes to this list of issues that I walked you through that John Ling identifies as aspects of the culture of death, we Christians tend to confront the culture of death by lobbying for laws that enshrine a sanctity of life. And when it comes to, when that fails, when legislature fails, we confront the culture by lobbying for court rulings protecting life. And let me be very clear, there is nothing wrong with these. Laws and court rulings are super important. And I do not at all think that Christians should be working any less to change the laws and to ensure that the courts rule in favor of life rather than in favor of death. So this is fine. I think that Christians do a lot in this area in terms of actions, in terms of cultural CPR. But as we start to look into each of those individual medical and bioethics issues more closely, I think we might start to see that maybe we are lacking in our actions. In fact, maybe we are undercutting our own efforts. Let's take abortion and infanticide for a moment. We Christians are rightly identifying abortion as murder, and rightly urging pregnant women not to sin, not to commit this heinous sin of murder. That, I think, we're right to do. But the question I want to ask is, are we equally, at least, to at least the same degree that we are urging pregnant women not to commit the sin of murder, are we inviting them, are we insisting that they let us help and support them? Because one of the reasons, a big reason why a lot of women turn to abortion and indeed to infanticide is because they don't think they can do it on their own, and they think they'll have to do it on their own. Raise their child, I mean. So could it be that we think life is valuable enough to burden mothers, but not enough to burden ourselves? I think that may be part of the problem. We are not stepping up to the plate enough and helping and supporting young women who fear that they're going to be all alone in raising their children. Remember what my teenage relative has identified about social atomization? This is part of the problem. We've become less and less families and communities that can help young women to raise their children. So of course they're going to fear raising children alone and consider the easy way out, or at least what they think is an easy way out. Also, we Christians rightly insist that what would be a challenging life for the mother doesn't justify killing the unborn. Of course it doesn't. Of course you don't get to murder somebody just because they might make your life difficult. But maybe we need to convince would-be mothers that despite the challenges that will be very real, their lives will actually be enriched by having children. Maybe we're not doing a good enough job of that. I mean, a lot of Christians in TikTok videos and in Facebook Reels and stuff make funny videos about how much of a challenge their children are. Maybe we need to be as much as or more than that, making funny videos about how much of a joy our children are. Some of those women turn to abortions and infanticide, or at least consider them, because they would be single mothers. And maybe they need to see us as Christians and as the church honor single mothers more than we condemn single motherhood. Yes, intentionally going out and having a child as a single mother is a problem, and it's certainly a problem for husbands to leave, or for fathers to abandon their children's mothers to be raised by their mothers alone. There's a lot to condemn there, but are we honoring women that have no other choice but to be single mothers? I contend that maybe we're not, and maybe that's contributing to women feeling like they have to turn to abortion and infanticide. You see, my contention here is that our actions need to be such that we're not merely opposing abortion. We've also got to be champions of life, and not just the life of the unborn child. We need also to be a champion of the life of the mother. And maybe we haven't been. Look at those issues, surrogacy and in vitro fertilization that I talked about earlier. We Christians rightly praise, promote, and even facilitate, like in terms of places where people can go, we facilitate adoption as a better alternative to these technologies. But do we give the impression to the world that a childless life is deficient and less worthy of living? I'm the first to push back when people say that Christians like idolize or make idols out of or worship families with children. That's not the case. We cherish children and families, and we think that they are crucial to the health and survival of the population. But I don't think we idolize or worship them. But maybe we do give the world the impression that there's something deficient about a life without children. In the way that we uplift, edify, hold up to public, to show the public the great mothers that Christian mothers often can be. But maybe we're not lifting up and praising people that choose not to have children. I propose that we need to publicly support and promote the lives and work ministries of more single Christians, so that people who can't have children might say, you know what, maybe we don't need to turn to surrogacy or in vitro fertilization. Maybe we can just be on fire for God and be his agents in the world without children. You see, our actions need to be such that we're not merely opposing deadly attempts at having kids. We also need to champion life, both of parents and of non-parents. How about euthanasia? We Christians, I think, are right to oppose the legalization of euthanasia and of assisted dying, which again is just suicide. But sadly, some of us are driving people to want to end their lives by condemning psychiatric and pharmaceutical treatments of depression. There is a really dangerous and deadly attitude among many Christians that turning to medication or to psychotherapy for help with mental issues is somehow sinful, or at the very least, unworldly. but it is not, at least not inherently. And look, no matter what your view of human constitution is, whether you believe we have souls or not, the fact of the matter is the shape of our brains, the health of our brains affect our disposition, our thoughts, our minds. There's just no way around that. And so if you're comfortable taking aspirin for a headache, well, maybe you should be okay with a Christian taking a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, an SSRI, in order to deal with anxiety or depression. Because if people find relief for their depression in psychiatric and pharmaceutical treatments, then maybe they won't turn to killing themselves. And also, the terminally ill and the interminably suffering need to see from us that suffering can be sacred. I watched a recent episode of Justin Brierley's unbelievable radio program recently, in which a Jewish rabbi, in a discussion over euthanasia, says that there's nothing sacred about suffering. Well, I think we as Christians need to fight the temptation to say and believe that drivel. Suffering can be sacred, and if the world doesn't see us saying as much and treating it as something that can be sacred, then where else are they going to turn? Why would they endure it? Rather, why not just turn to death? So our actions, if we're going to perform cultural CPR, cannot be limited to merely opposing euthanasia and assisted suicide. We've also got to champion life, even the lives of those who are suffering and dying. And how about prenatal screening and eugenics? We Christians rightly oppose selective abortion and the destructive research upon embryos. But do we support and promote the lives of families with special needs children? I think that there's some degree to which we do, but I don't think that we do nearly enough. I don't see big popular ministries where people are showing how joyful it can be to be a parent of a special needs child. I don't see much of that. And also, we need a flood of Christian scientists who can do research that shows that we can make the kinds of scientific and medical advancements that are trying to be made by killing embryos, but without doing that research on embryos. The church in America and in the West, I think, has a problem with anti-intellectualism and with telling the flock that there are certain fields that are too worldly or that aren't sacred enough or whatever. There are a lot of Christians who think that who just think that the realm of science and the profession of scientist isn't worth it. Or maybe it's because of anti-science tendencies within the church. And I say that as a young earth creationist. Maybe we are telling would-be Christian scientists that the profession of science isn't worth it. And maybe we need to be changing that and commissioning a flood of Christians to go into the realm of science and unlock even greater advances in medicine and science without destroying embryos than the scientists who are killing embryos are accomplishing. You see, we can't, our actions, if we're going to perform CPR, can't be limited merely to opposing selective abortion and eugenics. We've also got to champion life, even the lives of the severely disabled. And remember, I said earlier that the culture of death isn't limited to the issues of medical bioethics, and neither are our deficiencies in action limited to issues of medical bioethics. Remember, I talked about obesity and fat acceptance? What if gluttony and sedentariness, laziness, sluggardness, slothfulness, what if these have become acceptable, unspoken sins? I've been to church services where at the back of the sanctuary there are tables with rows and rows and rows of donuts for people. Well, I understand the desire to treat and feed your congregation, but are we encouraging really poor healthful habits? There are studies that show that religious people, deeply committed religious people for whom their faith shapes their lives, live happier lives. But those studies also show that they don't live healthier or more active lives. We are just as obese, just as slothful as the world. Theology and apologetics ministries like mine are a dime a dozen. But what about health and fitness ministries? Really solid, good ones. I don't think there are enough of these, and that's why I'm thankful for my colleagues at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary, like Jonathan Pritchett, who has started a Theology Geek Fitness YouTube channel that I'd highly encourage you to check out. He's trying to perform cultural CPR, even if he doesn't know it. You see, our claim to be pro-life rings hollow when we silently tolerate a pandemic of deadly poor health. What about that mutilation and infertility that's caused by gender reassignment efforts that I talked about earlier? Well, what if we've promoted gender stereotypes that many don't fit and do find stifling? Maybe if young people feel like there are these rigid gender stereotypes that they can't fit, well, of course they're going to wonder if perhaps that's not, in fact, their gender. So, what if your church has a women's ministry with flowers and pretty writing? You know, and the model of womanhood that we promote is a woman who is, you know, has her hair done nicely and she's made up and she's dressed attractively and she's in the kitchen cooking for her family. Beautiful picture, by the way. And I was incredibly thankful when my wife decided very, very, very early on in our marriage that she didn't want to work. She wanted to be a homemaker. Well, praise God. And you know what? She faced a lot of pressure from the culture to make the decision to be a stay-at-home mom instead of go out into the world and make a difference or something like that. So I'm not saying that these are bad, but maybe they are too limiting. Maybe we should be promoting more than just this vision of womanhood. Because if this is what a young woman sees as what Christians think a woman should be, where is a Olympic powerlifting athlete going to fit into that? This Olympic powerlifting athlete. Maybe she will think, well, gosh, maybe I'm actually a boy. What about a woman who feels called to go into business and be a CEO? Maybe she'll feel like, well, maybe I shouldn't because I'm a girl. Maybe I'm actually a boy. Maybe that's why I have this dream. What about women scientists, young women who are interested in science and want to go out and do science for a living? Maybe they don't feel like the model of womanhood that we are promoting and holding up is one in which they fit. How about rockers and girls that like to dress in what are not stereotypically feminine and attractive ways? They're gonna, if they see the church lifting up as the model of womanhood, a model that they feel like they don't fit, is it any wonder that they're going to turn to, or that they're going to feel tempted to think that maybe they're a boy in a woman's body? And it's not just women. Men's ministry very often features things like tools and gears and, you know, all this kind of manly stuff, right? And the model of manhood that we hold up is, you know, they're going to be into sports and fixing stuff and, you know, going out into the woods and these kinds of things. Well, first of all, I've never felt like I fit in that kind of ministry and that kind of model manhood. I don't fix stuff. I read and I write and I play video games. I don't fit into that. What about young men who may be interested in dance? If they are given the impression that that's a feminine thing, that's what girls do, not what boys do, well, maybe they'll start to think that they're girls in a man's body. What about young men who are interested in fashion design? If they are told that that's something women do and that men fix stuff and go out, watch sports, maybe they'll think those young men will think that maybe they're actually girls in a young man's body. Or what about would-be stay-at-home dads? If dads that feel like they want to stay at home and care for the children while their mothers go out into the workplace, if they are told that no, the woman is the one who's supposed to be taking care of the household and the men should be out in the workplace, they're not going to feel like they fit. You see, I want to propose to you that our opposition to so-called gender reassignment is hamstrung by our own narrow definitions of masculinity and femininity. And maybe that's something that we need to revisit. How about occurrences of school shootings? I mentioned those earlier. Well, what if? Look, I'm a defender of the right to bear arms. I own a gun myself. And I think that attempts to restrict gun rights are outright rejections of the Bill of Rights. And I'm always telling people, look, if you want to restrict gun rights, then do so the legal way, the right way, which is to amend the Constitution. So I'm not saying what I'm about to say from the perspective of somebody who wants to restrict gun rights, no. But it does seem to me as if we excessively celebrate, own, and flaunt virtual armories of lethal firearms. Could it be that our excessive admiration and adoration of guns may be enabling and motivating violence and killing, the likes of which we're seeing more and more of and lamenting more and more? I think that's possible. So, to sum up this part of my presentation, I know my presentation is going long. I apologize. But that's the great thing about a virtual conference is that you don't necessarily need to sit and watch it all in one sitting. But at the end of this section, here's the point I'm getting at. Our pro-life profession and our efforts to reform the culture of death, I think, are undermined by many ways that we contribute to that very culture by both our action and our inaction. And I think that perhaps that's an indication that our own culture is a culture of death. We call ourselves pro-life, but what if we're actually pro-death more than we realize? And that leads me to this next portion of my presentation where I want to talk about the church's role in cultural CPR. We were looking at this earlier and talking about how in order to bring a person back to life, in order to bring a culture of death back to life, we need to breathe life into it, and that's action. And that's what I've been talking about so far. But notice something. You can't breathe life into death unless you're alive and breathing yourself. You see, we were looking so far at the role that actions play in producing results. But what the results pyramid that I mentioned earlier captures is that there's actually far more involved in producing results than just actions. Beneath the layer of actions is culture. It's our values, it's our principles. And when we focus only on the actions that we might take in order to produce the results that we want, we're falling into what some people have called the action trap. The trap of trying to produce results purely by changing actions. But that's not going to work. If our actions may betray that our culture is a culture of death, and if we don't change the culture, then our actions won't stick. First, if we do them at all, we won't continue doing them, and we won't do them effectively. And so we need to look at what's beneath the layer of actions and what actually contributes more to results than just actions. We need to look at the beliefs that drive the actions and the experiences that reinforce the beliefs. We need to reform our culture. The way that the authors of Change the Culture, Change the Game put it is that experiences foster beliefs, and beliefs influence actions, and actions produce results. It's not just actions. It's experiences, beliefs, and actions. Your whole culture produces your results. The Pope John Paul II knew this. He said that the church counters the culture of death not with actions, at least not exclusively or primarily with actions, but with a culture. The church, he says, counters the culture of death with a culture of love. Well, I want to argue that we need to counter the culture of death with a culture of life that maybe we don't fully embrace. You see, the church doesn't challenge and reform culture through external action alone. It challenges and reforms culture by visibly embodying a better, godlier culture. You see, what I'm arguing here is that the church can't breathe life into a culture of death without first embracing a culture of life. Jesus said as much, just in different words. He says in Matthew 5:13, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot." The meaning here, Jesus' meaning is fairly straightforward, but Craig Blomberg really helps to draw it out. He points out in his commentary on this passage that salt's use as a preservative in the ancient world, a preservative in food, was probably its most basic function. Loses its saltiness is not the scientifically impossible notion of salt becoming flavorless, but rather the common problem in the ancient world of salt being mixed with various impure substances and therefore becoming worthless as a preservative. Perhaps we are failing at cultural CPR because we've lost our ability to preserve and arrest corruption. He goes on to say that to be thrown out and trampled on by men doesn't affirm anything about eternal security. Jesus isn't talking about whether you're secure or not. Rather, as Luke 14:35 makes even clearer, this phrase refers to the world's response to Christians if they do not function as they should. You see, the culture isn't listening to the church's witness. We know that. Perhaps it's because we've lost our saltiness. Perhaps it's because our efforts at breathing life into a culture of death are being stymied by impure things we have embraced into our culture that have therefore caused us as salt to lose our saltiness. And that's going to require that we look at the rest of the results pyramid. The church's role in CPR doesn't begin externally with actions, even though it does involve actions. It begins internally by reforming our own culture. We must revisit our beliefs if we're going to breathe life into a culture of death. And so that's where I want to turn now, is to beliefs. So that brings us now to this next layer, this even more foundational layer of beliefs that drive our actions. And I want to propose that there are 3 beliefs that the church has got to embrace if it's going to fully be a culture of life. I want to begin, and this is not going to surprise anybody. Rethinking Hell is a ministry that promotes conditional immortality. I am most known for promoting and defending conditional immortality. So I'm going to begin with that. Fully embracing, and yeah, this is going to be a bold claim, but I'm going to try to substantiate it. Number 1, fully embracing a culture of life requires embracing conditional immortality. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying that you must be a conditionalist in order to be a part of a culture of life. What I'm saying is that fully, maximally embracing a culture of life requires embracing conditional immortality. You see, I propose that the view according to which immortality will be lived out forever in eternal torment makes life neutral. It's neither good nor bad inherently. It is either blessing or curse depending upon the circumstances. And it could be, and I would argue it is, that a culture of death is one that sees life as a curse and as a threatened penalty. And many in the church for centuries have seen, for some, life as a curse and as a threatened penalty. That sounds like a culture of death to me. Just listen to the language that advocates of eternal torment have used over the years. 1,000 years ago, St. Anselm says that in hell the damned will cry out, "I want to die! Dying and dying, still I cannot die." In the Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards says that the wicked are said in Scripture to be immortal in misery. Same time frame, but in Europe, George Whitefield is again pretending to give the words of somebody that is suffering in hell, and this person suffering in hell, in George Whitefield's words, cries out, "Must I live forever, tormented in these flames? Must I live forever?" 100 years later, Robert McShane says that in hell they shall wish to die and shall not be able. And Jerry Vines, just 10 years ago, says that in hell the damned will cry out, "Let me die!" But no death occurs in hell. And this is just a sampling. If you get a copy of our second book, A Consuming Passion, Essays on Hell and Immortality in honor of Edward Fudge, friend of the ministry, Ronnie Demler, has a great contribution in the book called Sic et Non, which means yes and no. Traditionalism's Scandal is the subtitle. And it's all about how throughout history, believers in eternal torment have had to say both yes and no to a number of questions. Will the lost live forever? Well, yes and no. Will they be destroyed? Well, yes and no, etc., etc., etc. And so you can find quotes like these and several others in that contribution. Well, I want to propose that the culture of death won't see and embrace the sacredness of life if they hear from us that they'll wish for death in a life that's intended as punishment. By contrast, look at how conditionalists spoke about life and immortality in the 1st and 2nd century. Clement of Rome, writing around 95 AD, "Blessed are the gifts of God, including life in immortality." What is the implication? That life and immortality are gifts that some won't receive. Here, life is sacred. It's a blessing. It's a joy. It's a gift. Ignatius of Antioch, right around the same period of time, says that Jesus died in order to breathe immortality into his church. This is a view that upholds life and immortality as a blessing, as a joy, as a good. Barnabas says that those believing on Jesus shall live forever. He's writing around that same time. So too was the Didache, written around that same time, and it speaks of immortality which was made known to us through Jesus. This is a view that these early fathers are promoting, according to which life and immortality are gifts to be desired, longed after. Gifts which are desired and longed after. Second Clement, writing around 140 AD, encourages people to partake of the Spirit, because the Spirit, infusing resurrected bodies of the believers, gives them life and immortality. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing in the latter half of the 2nd century, says that the lost man deprives himself of length and days forever and ever. The loss, according to Irenaeus, the loss of enduring life and existence is a great tragedy. Theophilus says that the believer will receive as reward from Christ immortality. It's a reward that is received as a gift from Christ. Melito of Sardis says that from God comes abundant good with immortal life forever. You see, again, I want to contend that the culture of death won't be drawn toward the sacredness of life if they're told they'll wish for a death in a life intended as punishment. And you can see how the way conditionalists have spoken about life and immortality is so much likelier to motivate a culture of death to breathe life again, because we would be a culture that cherishes and longs for life and immortality and doesn't see it as possibly a curse and as a punishment. Number two, moving on from conditional immortality, I want to argue that fully embracing a culture of life requires embracing the tragic nature of death. I think, unfortunately, too many Christians have come to believe that death is a good thing. In fact, a lot of the Christian culture seems to have their ultimate eschatological hope set on going to heaven when they die. But I want to argue that a culture whose hope is in heaven at death doesn't treasure life. Jesus says in Matthew 6:21 that where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Well, think about this for a moment. If a Christian's ultimate hope is to go to heaven when they die, rather than in resurrection and glorification, well, their treasure then is in going to heaven in death. Well, then that's where their heart is, in death. A culture whose hope is in heaven at death doesn't treasure life. But it's more than that. Even those who do place their ultimate eschatological hope in being resurrected from the dead, many of them still will say that a dead loved one is, they'll try to console somebody by saying, don't worry, they're in a better place. Well, hold on. A culture in which the dead are in a better place maybe does not treasure life. And although you do have one or two statements in Scripture where people talk about, like Paul, for example, saying he longs to depart and be with Christ, there are a number of ways of interpreting what Paul is saying there. But the overall biblical picture of death is that it's not a place where it's not something to be longed after. So I want to propose that the culture of death won't be drawn toward the sacredness of life if they see us longing for death in order to escape from life. And then thirdly, in this category of beliefs, I want to suggest that fully embracing a culture of life requires embracing the restoration, not replacement, of this presently groaning cosmos. You see, what I'm trying to argue here is that a culture like ours so often is, that looks forward to the planet's destruction, is going to see the planet as disposable. If you think that this is not all that popular, just look at this quote from John MacArthur. This is a recent quote. He says, John MacArthur does, that Earth was never intended to be a permanent planet. It's a disposable planet. Why? Because he has a particular eschatology according to which when Christ returns, the world will be destroyed and replaced with a new one. A new heaven and new earth, even though scholars tend to recognize that what's new about it isn't that it's replaced, but rather that it's transformed, it's restored. I mean, in the book of Romans, Paul talks about the present creation groaning, not to be replaced, but to take part, to partake of the freedom of the glorification of the saints. But conversely, I want to contend a culture looking forward to the planet's restoration will start that work now. And I say this as somebody who's not a tree-hugging, rabid environmentalist. I oppose proposals that would have us move too quickly, too suddenly, too radically away from fossil fuels, in ways that would result in the collapse of our economy. I oppose a lot of the environmentalist movement. And yet, I can look around me and around the world and see that we are not, as a human population, taking very good care of this planet. And that's even more problematic when it comes to us as Christians, because as Christians, we recognize that part of our purpose as humanity is to exercise stewardship over our planetary home. And so I do think that we as Christians have neglected our creation mandate to be stewards of this good earth that God has given us, and which will one day be restored, and we will enjoy in all its restored glory for all eternity. So I want to propose that embracing a culture of life, one that will nurture and fight for the life of the planet that we are on, is one that will require first the belief that our planet won't be replaced, but will instead be restored. In short, the culture of death won't be drawn toward the sacredness of life if they see us treating all known life's home as if it's disposable. I'm sure other beliefs could be identified. I even have some in mind, but I think that with how long my presentation is going, and with the fact that we are talking about engaging the culture as it pertains to afterlife, I'll leave it at those three and encourage you as a community to work with us to identify others. But let me just reiterate the three. Number one, fully embracing a culture of life requires embracing conditional immortality. Number two, fully embracing a culture of life requires embracing the tragic nature of death. And number three, fully embracing a culture of life requires embracing the restoration, not replacement, of this presently groaning cosmos. And with that, I'll turn to the last item, and this will be where I end. The experiences that we might need to embrace as the church in order to perform cultural CPR and breathe life into a culture of death. This is the bottom of the results pyramid that is observing, that is recognizing, that is capturing the reality that our experiences, that a culture's experiences reinforce their beliefs. So if our actions are undermining our own efforts at producing the results of breathing life into a culture of death, we've talked about how that may be because we have certain beliefs that are lending themselves to those deficient actions. And so we looked at some of the beliefs that might need to be changed in order to drive actions that will more substantially lend themselves to breathing life back into a culture of death. But now we need to talk about what experiences we could possibly have and make possible for our people that might reinforce those beliefs that drive those actions. Excuse me. But I've got a problem here, which is that I don't have any ideas. Not any good ones, at least. Not any that I think are good. I am an imbalanced person myself. I spend the vast majority of my spare time and all of my work time in front of a computer doing digital things. I'm a software programmer for a living, and in my non-work time when I'm with my kids, I'm very often playing video games with them. My wife and I enjoy television and movies and things. What I don't do much of anything of is experiencing the fullness that life has to offer. I'm just trying to be honest. So I think I can speak somewhat knowledgeably to what beliefs we might need to change in order to reinforce or drive the kinds of actions that I think will be required in order to breathe life into the culture of death. But when it comes to what experiences we might need, I don't know. I don't even know what that looks like. And so this final part of my presentation, you're looking at it, which might be a relief for some of you since I've been speaking for about an hour and a half now, probably considerably longer than any of my other fellow speakers. And so I just want to leave this with you, the people, our conference attendees. If I'm right, that as a church, we have, as the church, we have not fully embraced a culture of life, then we're not going to act in a way that will breathe life back into the culture of death. And we can change our beliefs. I think some of our beliefs that I've talked about will help that, but we're going to need to, as the church, if I'm right, we're going to need to, as the church, identify some ways that we can bake experiences into what it means to be a Christian in the West, experiences that reinforce the kinds of beliefs and actions that are needed to perform cultural CPR. And I don't know what those look like, and so I leave that question to you. I have a few thoughts, very minor, inchoate ones. Taking a group of people and spending a few days camping in the woods away from modern amenities and engrossing yourself in the fallen but still very beautiful and thriving world that God has created. That could be something that can start to, doing that regularly, in fact, can be something that will start to reinforce, an experience that will reinforce the kinds of life-giving beliefs that I think that we need to have. Spending time with people who are suffering and yet loving life and are thankful for life, that is probably going to be really critical, but I don't know what that looks like. Maybe going to hospital wings where people are being treated constantly for serious medical problems and are suffering, but who are, maybe they've got ministries. Maybe they're serving because they love life and are so thankful to have life, even though they are suffering. Spending time with those kinds of people, reading books written by those kinds of people might be the kinds of experiences that we need. Maybe regularly taking our families and our churches to wildlife preserves or to zoos where we can see the beauty that the world God has created has, and learn about how important exercising stewardship over this planet is for that life's ability to go on thriving. Maybe that is the kind of experience that we need to have regularly in order to reinforce life-giving beliefs. Part of the problem, though, is, as I said, experience isn't something that I really that it's not my wheelhouse. It's not something that I take very seriously because I am imbalanced in the ways that I've described. But secondly, I'm also a fairly affluent Christian who can afford to miss work to go camping or to go to a zoo, a wildlife preserve, who can do lots of things. And there are a lot of people who don't have those kinds of luxuries. And I don't know what experiences are needed there. So I'm rambling now at this tail end of my presentation. But the reason I'm rambling is because I just don't have a good answer here. And we as the church are going to need to work together to identify what kinds of experiences we as the church need to make possible and regular for our people, so that that will reinforce in them life appreciating beliefs that will then drive the kinds of actions needed to breathe life into a culture of death. So that's where I'll leave you, encouraging you to continue this conversation. And as you reflect upon the other speakers' presentations and how you can engage the culture in order to take the life-saving gospel of Jesus Christ to a dying world that so desperately needs it, I hope that you will consider how perhaps the actions that we as the church are most known for are insufficient to breathe life into a culture of death, and perhaps are undermining our own efforts to do so. And I hope that you'll consider and reflect upon how perhaps there are beliefs that are very popular in Western Christianity that are driving those culture of death supporting actions. And maybe those beliefs need to be changed. And I hope that you'll consider and reflect upon what experiences we as the church might need to make possible and regular for the average Christian, so that those experiences will reinforce beliefs that make it possible to take better actions to breathe life into a culture of death. Because I think all of that, not just actions, but also our own beliefs and experiences, that is our culture, needs to change if we're going to breathe life into a culture of death. Cultural CPR is going to require a transformation of our own culture from one that is far more a culture of death than we would like to admit, to one that is far more of a culture of life than it actually is. So thank you so much for attending this 8th annual Rethinking Hell Conference. Thank you for putting up with me speaking for an hour and a half. I hope it's been convicting and useful, and I hope that you'll join us next year wherever our annual conference takes us. God bless and take care.